All right. How's everybody doing today? Doing all right? Okay. Sent out that announcement on Quiz 2. Okay. So, again, Quiz 2 is tough. And again, I will say that you all, on average, although it may not seem like it, you actually didn't do super bad. Like, this is and I don't know why, but Quiz 2 is a beast. There's a big dip in sort of where people are at sort of with this stuff. And so again, if you struggled with it, that's fine. Lots of people do. It doesn't sort of what we want to do is start to go through and sort of make adjustments from there. Remember that you've got a drop plus a optional final that you can retake. So again, at worst, you're starting with sort of a clean slate, right? So what we want to do is just make sure if that we need to make adjustments, that we get those adjustments made. Come talk with me, set up appointments. I got appointments set up with people. If we can do it during office hours, that's fantastic. I'll get you scheduled in. If we can't, we'll just do something one-on-one. We'll fit you in there somewhere to make sure that we're going through diagnosing where things have maybe gotten off track. We can go through your quizzes. We can always go through and take a look and see what you've done well, what things maybe you've struggled with, and sort of start to tailor some adjustments so that you can improve scores moving forward with stuff. Okay. Other thing too, I know I keep saying this over and over and over again, but I'm trying to, and I'm probably preaching to the choir to the people who are keyed in right now, but the research thing is important, okay? So if you haven't yet gone through and created a Sona account, completed the that initial pre-screener, again, that's going to give you your first hour of research, and it's also going to open up opportunities for participation down the road, so that you want to make sure that you've gone in, got that taken care of. Pre-screen will be open through this weekend. But do it today. Do it as soon as we finish up, just so that you have it done out of the way, so that you don't forget. And then come Monday, you're like, I didn't do that. It doesn't knock you out of the system, right? You don't have to do it, but what it's going to do is it's going to open up opportunities for other research projects and things like that. Okay. Any questions about research, about sort of where we're going, any of this stuff? Okay, cool. Samantha, I see you're there on the screen. Anything to add, or any SI updates or announcements or anything?
Um, no SI updates. But I would second that. It's super helpful if you do that pre-screen. So, and it doesn't take that much attention, honestly, if you're having like a stressful day.
Damn it, Samantha! Don't say that we want people. Is Samantha say like it doesn't take that much attention? I disagree.
I meant like it doesn't take that much like brain power.
There
Like
we
if you're
go.
having a
Okay.
stressful day, and but you want to still be productive. Take that time, go do the
There we go.
pre-screen. You'll learn a lot about yourself while you're doing it, and then you'll still be productive without having to like sit down and like write notes from a book.
Yeah.
That's what I meant.
There we go. And I agree with that too, right? I mean, it's a survey. It's asking you questions about thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and stuff like that. So, yeah, it's kind of sort of busy work that doesn't require you to think a lot or try and integrate or remember much of anything, right? So, Samantha, I apologize for cursing at you. That wasn't a necessary thing to do.
That's okay. It does. You guys gotta think about it because it is important.
All right. So yeah, just make sure that you get on, do that, get that out of the way, and then start keeping on track. Because again, once that pre-screener comes down, a lot of different people who are doing different studies, they'll use that to see who might be eligible for different projects and things. And so you'll start to see lots and lots and lots of more studies pop online that you'll be able to schedule, participate in. Just as you're going through, remember that I'm going to give you good citizen points. So as long as you just show up for everything that you're signed up to participate in and go through and complete it, I'll give you bonus points just for not having any unexcused no-shows. If you make a mistake, if you forget, if you blow out of an appointment or something like that, it's not the end of the world. Like it doesn't, If you do it 3 times, it'll kick you out of the system, but it won't mean anything for us outside of you just miss out on that sort of extra bonus. But just try and be mindful. Sona's pretty slick in terms of sending you reminders. Just make sure that whatever email address that you included in Sona as your sort of primary contact is something that you check, because otherwise if you give it a sort of a rando email address, it'll send stuff to your rando email address that you don't check, and you won't get updates and reminders and things like that. So, all right. So question, and this is a good one. Do we actually have to go to appointments? Is it just a survey that we take? The pre-screener is just a survey, right? So you just go through and do it. And honestly, I can't say with 100% certainty, but with COVID stuff, there's probably not going to be a lot of face-to-face studies, if any, in psychology. It's possible that some people that could have an in-person appointment, assuming that things stay stable and stuff, but probably the vast majority of studies that you'll participate will be online. Okay, and so some of those studies may have, require you to log in and complete a short survey, sort of for a series of surveys for some stuff, right? So that might require you to pay a little more attention to stuff. Other projects are just going to say, hey, you have to have this survey completed by the end of the semester, which is then or whenever you want to take it. So just read the stuff carefully, and make sure that you know sort of when you're supposed to be on, filling things out. As long as you do that, you're going to be okay. Sound good? Okay, cool. Let's then jump into material. All right. Gonna start to get in. We're still gonna stay with some bio type stuff with this. Talking about some genetics, some development, things along these lines. So starting to understand that genes are important. Genes have a huge impact on development, but how we've gone through and thought about how genetic influences impact psychological functioning and processes has kind of changed as we've gotten more and more sophisticated in some of this. I see Cade likes my slide. I saw. That's good. Pretty good. All right. Okay. So first thing, sort of basic, and again, this is just basic sort of information, talking about chromosomes, DNA, things along these lines. If we're talking about chromosome, this is just a structure containing DNA and supportive proteins. We've got a chromosome right down here. Humans, 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs, sort of connected in sort of down here, right? So your chromosomes contain your DNA, which is your information. We got 23 pairs, or we got chromosomes from 46 chromosomes, 23 from mom, 23 from dad, coming together to put together your instructions, right? This is the stuff that tells your sort of you as an organism, how everything goes through and fits together, okay? A chromosome is different than the DNA. DNA is our helical molecule, so we can see it down in through here, containing the instructions for development and functioning. So all the manual for how your body works, puts together, sort of all that stuff contained within your DNA. Each chromosome, one continuous strand of DNA. Okay, and we can kind of see that sort of running down through here. All right. And what we see is, and this is happened in my lifetime. So I was born in 1980, which I realized at one point didn't make me super old, but now is starting to get there, right? But over the course of my lifetime, huge advances in terms of starting to unravel and start to tease apart sort of what's actually going on with DNA, and sort of coding it and sort of mapping it out and how everything fits together. And what we see is amazing levels of similarity at the level of DNA across different organisms, right? So again, when we map out sort of the human genome and so the chimpanzee genome, look at the DNA, 96% shared DNA between chimpanzees and humans, right? Which you could say, okay, maybe I can see because they're sort of both primates, things like that. But even if we start to go down, we see about 80% shared DNA between humans and, say, your average field mouse, okay? Which maybe start to gets more surprising. Why? How do we understand these similarities at the level of DNA? Because I think of myself as quite different than a field mouse. If I saw a field mouse and me, I'm not saying, oh, these are 80% similar. We appear to be quite different. But at the level of DNA, like, how do we understand what's going on with this?
So, in terms of DNA, you have your, what is it, adenine, guanine, cytosine, those things, the pairs that make up each rung in the ladder of your DNA. And a lot of those can be similar without actually making you different.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, so those combinations of I don't know what they're called, elements, I guess.
Yeah.
Are like, those combinations can be very close to each other, but still not result in like a humongous similarity.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Heidi, thank you. Heidi just popped in nucleotides, right? Yeah. So again, basically, we've got the same set of small parts, right, that are sort of going through and building in our DNA, right? And so it's not like we got a completely different set of materials for the mouses for me, right? So you're absolutely right there. What about sort of how am I similar to a mouse or to a lizard or sort of any other such sort of living organism?
You got eyes, you got a heart. A lot of the anatomy is similar in different ways.
Yeah, exactly right, Michael. At the cellular level, right? Like, we're basically using the same game plan to put together me or put together a mouse, right? We've got cells. Cells work in a certain way, so they operate in a certain way. We've got nervous system, right? So one way to think about this is if you think about sort of like, oh, if I look at, a lawnmower and a Ferrari, those are very different machines, right? But if we think about like, well, they're all kind of working with the same basic principle, right? There's an internal combustion engine. Internal combustion engine works on a lot of the same principles, right? Did everybody see that I just compared myself to a Ferrari? That was pretty sweet, right? They're like, clap's pretty snazzy and sophisticated. But I mean, we're basically working with the same sort of type of stuff, right? We upgraded it and we made it more complicated. But at the cellular level, sort of me and a flatworm are kind of working on the same sort of basic components in terms of how cells put together. And so we see lots and lots of overlap at the level of DNA. That's not saying that everything's exactly the same. It's just saying we're working with a lot of the same parts. Okay, so if we're talking about genes, these are going to be segments of DNA, and these are going to code. These are segments that code for a specific protein that starts to impact physiology. Now, if you're in bio or biosciences stuff, you're going to get into a lot more of the mechanisms. We're not going to worry about that. But what's important to know is these genes. These are the sort of the code that says, okay, we're going to start to put together these types of proteins and these types of structures that start to influence my physiology. Okay, and sometimes the influence on your physiology or your sort of how your sort of body's put together starts to become expressed as something that we can see, some sort of observable characteristic or trait. Okay. And this is going to serve as the basic for behavior adaptation. I have certain structures, things are put together, and sometimes we see differences that are observable. Sometimes we don't see differences sort of based on this. But these genes and sort of the changes in the genes and how it goes through and starts to impact sort of specific protein production and physiology, this is the basis for genetic adaptation and sort of what we would talk about as the basis for at least at the biological level, for some of the psychological processes, or at least that's the assumption, right? If we're talking about allele, this is different versions of the same gene. Okay, and again, going back to high school bio, recognizing that we have some alleles, some versions of genes that are dominant, and some types of genes that are recessive. Okay, and this is just getting into Mendelian sort of genetics, how things put together. So can someone give me, who may have had in bio done some of this stuff before, give me examples of dominant and recessive alleles, or examples that that you kind of know about?
Brown hair versus blonde hair.
Okay, and Cade, which one is dominant there?
Brown.
Brown hair, right? So we would talk about brown hair as being a dominant gene, or a dominant allele, right? So I've got genes that sort of, well, not genes that grow my hair, because I don't have hair, but for most people have genes that grow sort of hair, right? And so as blonde, I was blonde at one point. And so we have genes that sort of go brown. And so we've got 23 genes from, chromosomes from mom, 23 from dad. And if we get genes from mom that are for blonde hair, genes from dad that are brown hair, what does Mendelian genetics say my hair color should be? What do you think, Cade? Or Colin, you're going to jump in? Brown, right? Because I've got a recessive and I've got a dominant. Dominant's going to win out, right? Colin, I'll keep with you. What if I got brown hair, a gene for brown hair from mom, gene from brown hair from dad? Still brown, probably, right? Unless there's something sneaking around in the background. What if I got blonde gene from mom, blonde gene from dad? Then we're going to be blonde, right? So, and I've gone through and getting good in the chat here. Eye color is an example. Emma's got recessive red hair. I have blonde hair and a very red beard. I'm not sure why this is sort of it goes blonde as I work up. It's fun. So we got red hair as recessive, detached earlobes, right? And so these are things that are often used as an examples of dominant or recessive. The problem is, and so this is something I've learned sort of going through and teaching. This isn't my area of expertise, but it looks like it's actually very, very difficult. So even though, eye color, hair color, earlobes, things like that actually involve multiple genes, right? It's often given an example as, oh, this one gene, it's recessive or dominant, makes a determination on this observable phenotype that we can see. But when I actually dug in, when you look at sort of people who actually work at this, they say, well, that's not actually a good example, because it's actually multiple genes that determine hair color, earlobes, things along those lines. The one thing I've been able to find, and I like this example a lot, that does appear to be determined by a single gene is earwax. Okay? So if you go through, like here, watch this. I'm going to, for everybody, sort of dig into your ear, sort of pull out some earwax, right? You do that. Daniel's not wanting to do that. So if you were to do this, sort of pull out some earwax. Not everybody's participating. I'm sort of taking notes on who is. If you were to look at your earwax, okay, what we would see is that most people are going to have sort of that wet, sticky, yellow earwax, right? Because that's sort of generally sort of what we have, at least in sort of Western countries here. But a small number of you, and I think sort of this is more sort of common in sort of East Asian countries, may have like a dry kind of gray earwax, right? And it looks like, based on sort of what I've been able to find, is there's a single gene that codes for either wet, sticky yellow earwax or dry gray earwax, right? And so if I have either one of my parents have genes that are passed along gene for wet, sticky earwax, I'm going to have wet, sticky earwax. But if I've got two parents, they both give me the gene for this dry sort of gray earwax, what's going to happen is I'm going to have dry gray earwax. Again, sort of assuming sort of everything sort of works out sort of correctly the way it is, right? So again, I think sort of this was an extended and elaborate discussion on something that sort of maybe isn't sort of terribly difficult or new to you, but the one thing I want to sort of emphasize, and we're going to hit this again and again and again, is a lot of the things that we take as common knowledge when we actually dig into it is considerably more complicated, right? And so anytime, right, and you'll probably hear this, someone said, oh, we found the gene for alcoholism. Alcohol abuse is an incredibly, incredibly complex psychological and behavioral phenomenon. There is no way that alcoholism is determined by one gene, okay? We might find that certain genes or combination of genes are involved in or more common in people who struggle with alcohol use, depression, schizophrenia, things along these lines, right? But it's an oversimplification to say, oh, I found this one gene that turns on or off or determines forever and for always whether or not I have this or that or the other thing. It's just far too complex. And so wanting to make sure as we go through this, recognizing that the genetic basis of behavior, we just don't know enough about stuff, and we're doing cool stuff to try and find markers and characteristics that seem to be playing in. But anytime you hear we found the gene for X, unless they're talking about earwax, I would be very skeptical about this, okay? Questions about sort of the basic machinery stuff that we're talking about here? Okay, cool. Oops, back on my track. Okay, so again, complex traits, complex behaviors, the things that we're often most worried about or interested in psychology is almost always going to be determined by multiple genes. We also see that coding for specific traits is not specifically evidence for the purpose of a gene. So I might have a gene that determines my hair color, or a set of genes that determines my hair color. So I've got genes that result in blonde hair or sort of maybe dark hair. Just because a gene codes for a certain thing, that's not in and of itself evidence that we have developed specifically, that those genes have developed specifically to code what type of beautiful hair I have, okay? Genes code for a lot of stuff. Probably if we're talking about hair color, those genes that are involved in sort of determining whether or not I have blonde hair or dark hair probably are involved in other types of things, right? So for example, if I find a gene that's involved in alcoholism, it's probably not evidence that sort of biologically, evolutionarily, we've developed genes for alcoholism because that's a good thing. It's probably a side effect, right? That's kind of come up. That's because these genes are coding for other types of things and behaviors and processes and things as well. So wanting to keep that in mind. And then the other thing too, and we'll get into this, recognizing that our genes can be activated and inactivated by environmental factors. It's not like, oh, these things are on all the time or off all the time. What we start to see as we've gotten more and more into this research is a very, very interesting area, is depending on the types of environment or the types of experience I have, can start to influence the expression of certain genes. And so this is an important thing to think about when we get into sort of twin research and trying to understand genetic influences of sort of different types of disorders that look to be very, very, very biologically determined or genetically influenced. I've got two identical twins. One's got something and one doesn't. Functionally, they're kind of genetic clones. And if it was all genes, we would expect them to 100%, if one had it, the other person had it, but we don't see that, right? And so recognizing that our experiences, the things that we're exposed to in life, can start to influence the expression of genes, and so that adding complexity to the picture. Okay. Questions on any of that stuff?
Those are called markers, right?
What's that, Cade?
Those are called markers when genes are activated or deactivated.
I'm not. I don't know when I think about markers, or when I've heard or talked about markers, talking about like, oh, this is a genetic marker for something in that it's correlated with something or outcome. In terms of the activating or sort of turning on or off the expression of a certain gene, I don't know. Does anybody know, or has anybody heard of sort of use of that terminology? Someone with a bio background. Nothing. All right, Colin or Cade, I'll look into that and see. I can't tell you with 100% confidence. Will you email me? Because otherwise I'll forget. Sort of just a hot moment. Cool. All right. Okay. All right. So when we get into in sort of psychology, behavior, if we're starting to look at the relative contribution of genetics and environment on behavior, this gets into this nature-nurture idea, right? What are we when we're born, and our behaviors, who we become? Is it because we're genetically destined to become the people that we become, or are we accumulation of our experiences and things along these lines, right? As we're going through in studying this gets into the study of behavioral genetics, okay? Behavioral genetics looking at, okay, we have some certain trait or characteristic. Yeah.
Sorry, I hate to interrupt you, but is there any way you can go back a slide by chance?
Yeah.
Yeah, just for 1 minute. Thank you so much. Sorry for interrupting.
Oh, no problem. No problem. All right. So, the original sort of old school sort of approaching this, so the idea is to try and say, if we've got some trait or characteristic or some behavior, how much of this is due to genetics and how much of this is due to sort of environmental factors, okay? And this starts to get into sort of the idea of heritability. So the idea of or concept of heritability is trying to pull out or tease apart how much of what sort of degree of the differences in some type of trait are attributable to genetics. Okay, so coffee going down the wrong tube. If we were to go through and take a look at all of you right now, okay, we got sort of the Hollywood Squares picture, and I were to ask all of you to stand up, right, and we would do this if we were all together in a classroom and things like that, we would likely see people are different heights. Not likely we would, right? Different people are different heights, right? And so maybe the question is how much of the differences that we're seeing in height is determined by genetics, okay? This would be an issue of heritability. Now, heritability is not, so I'm 6'3", it's not 6 foot of my 6'3" is due to genetics and the last 3 is because of sort of what I ate as a kid or something. I had Wheaties or something like that, right? Important to think about when we're talking about heritability, we're talking about understanding why we get differences across individual people, okay? Same thing if we think about intellectual ability, right? If I were to go through and have you take cognitive achievement tests, take an IQ test or something like that, we're going to see across the sort of the population differences here, right? And so how do we understand these differences? How much of these differences are due to different people have different genetic makeups and different sort of code? And how much of this is because some people go to better schools, have different opportunities, things along these lines, okay? So this is the idea of heritability. And what ends up happening a lot of times is people end up thinking back, oh, sort of this amount of, or this number of points from my intellectual ability is due to sort of my parents and things like that, and the other portion is because I went to good schools, right? What we're doing is trying to get a sense of the power or the magnitude of the relationship between some type of trait and some type of genetic influence, okay? So this idea of heritability is very, very important. Any questions about what we're trying to do with heritability stuff?
This is like off topic.
Yeah.
Like completely.
Yeah.
But you were talking about how like when you were saying like you were born in the 80s and that's technically not old, like for a while and now it's considered old. The term fogey, then that's like a good indication that you're old.
Did I say fogey?
But no, but that's
okay.
a very good indication, and I assume you know what I mean.
Yeah. Well, I can go back through and check the tape. I don't think I have not yet referred to myself as a fogey or an old fogey.
But since you know what it means, you are one.
That was not a fair attack at all, Colin. I don't. Okay.
Well, since you know what it means, doesn't that mean you are one?
There. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, but I watch old people movies.
What? Just out of curiosity, what are you qualifying as old people movies?
Well, I've seen movies made in the 80s and they've used the term fogey.
Well, you know what? I feel like this is a lot of sort of bordering on age discrimination and being attacked for stuff that's Breakfast Club. Yeah, what? Yeah, Breakfast Club is a good movie. It's looking on Breakfast Club now. There's a lot of problematic stuff going on in Breakfast Club, but sort of that's sort of neat. It's, you know what? We're getting away from behavioral genetics. All right, we can talk about this in a review session or something. All right.
I do have something. I quickly looked up genetic markers while we were all talking.
Yeah.
And it's just any genetic parts that we can really identify, such as like A and B blood or
Okay.
blood, or even just hair colors. So not specifically genes that are affected by environment.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Kate. And so, yeah, and we'll talk about when we get into sort of a couple slides down, talking about sort of the study of sort of those types of things that go through and turn on and off genes and things along those lines, which is a sort of kind of the next level of stuff. Okay. But if we're talking about sort of classic behavioral genetics, kind of the formula for classic behavioral genetics is this idea that we have variability in some trait, whether it's height or intelligence or depression or something along these lines, right? We've got differences, right? Anytime you see variability, you should just say differences, all right? So differences. How do we explain the differences that we're seeing in some trait in a population? And from a classic behavioral genetics standpoint, our equation here is the differences that we're seeing are in some portion due to genetics, are some portion due to a shared environmental factors, and in some proportion due to unique environmental factors, okay? And depending on what we're interested in, we've got different types of studies that we can do to start to tease out some of these, sort of how much influence is being exerted by different areas, okay? So if we look at the very sort of basic sort of level of sort of behavioral genetics methodology, what we have is what we would call a family study, okay? And what we're looking at is the occurrence of some type of trait across relatives, okay? So let's say I'm a clinical psychologist, so I'm going to use clinical psychology things because that's easy for me to think about, okay? Zoe, we're going to get into shared environment in just a moment. I'll sort of help you out with that, okay? What we've got is, let's say I'm interested in depression, okay? And so what I do is I'm interested in the extent to which depression is more common in families of individuals with depression than among families or families of individuals without depression, okay? So the question that I'm trying to get at with a family study is a trait more common within a family, the family of an individual who has that trait? I can also start to, with these types of studies, look at whether or not the occurrence of some sort of trait starts to increase with the degree of the genetic relationship. So what I would do, if I'm interested in the genetic or sort of a family study on depression, what I would do is I would get a bunch of people with who struggle with depression, and a bunch of people who don't struggle with depression. Okay, so I've got two different groups. And then what I would do is I would start to go through and interview family members and probably close first degree relatives, but then I might start to get farther and farther out and see for the individuals who have who do struggle with depression, do I start to see that depression is more common in their families than in family member or than in the families of individuals who don't have depression. Okay. And if I do see that for the people who my people in my study who have depression, the depression is more likely that is more common occurs more commonly in their family members than people without depression, what might I start to conclude?
it's
What's that, Colin?
That there's a genetic influence.
Okay, Cade, that there's a genetic influence. Okay. And that might be one, and that might be one interpretation, right? So if I see that people who are depressed are more likely to have family members who are depressed than are people who don't have depression, that might start to give me a better sense for there could be some genetic impact, right? Or if I start to see that if I take people with depression, if their first degree family members are more likely to have depression than, say, second and third cousins, sort of distant aunts and uncles and things like that, starts to look like that the occurrence of depression starts to, or the likelihood of depression starts to increase as my sort of family members get closer and closer in terms of relation. Okay, so this can start to suggest that maybe there could be some level of genetic transmission of depression. Okay. What are the limitations of why can't I be super confident if I see again that people with depression have family members who are more likely to be depressed than people who don't have depression? What am I missing in this study?
Environment, what the environment's like.
Yeah, and specifically what type of environment, Cade?
Socioeconomic.
Yeah, right. This starts to get into, and Zoe, your question here, this shared environment piece. Okay, let's go through and take this into, instead of a depression, let's say aggression, right? What I want to know is I want to see whether or not aggression is more common in families of individuals who are aggressive than those individuals who aren't. And what I find is that if I find people who have struggled with difficulties with aggression, they tend to have family members who are more aggressive than people who don't struggle with aggression, right? So that could mean it could be genetics, but it could also mean that I just grew up in an aggressive home and I learned a lot of aggression. And so it has nothing to do with genetics. It's just sort of this shared environmental factor, right? When we're talking about shared environment, that's the stuff that we share with our family, our brothers and sisters. This is socioeconomic types of things, culture, all that type of stuff, right? And then our unique environment is the stuff that makes us different from our own personal experiences. The experiences that I've had that are different from my brothers or my mom or my dad's, that are my own type of thing, that influence who I am, who I become, and things along those lines, okay? So a family study is just a kind of a base level, trying to get a sense for, is a trait more common in family members of individuals who have this trait versus not? It's a good way to sort of start to see whether or not certain traits runs in families. But in terms of, is it getting at specific genetics? No, right? Because we can't tease out that shared environment, right? How much of this is genetics and how much of this is actually just being influenced by, I just grew up in a family where mom and dad were depressed, and so I just kind of picked up sort of ways of coping and learning things that maybe put me at greater risk for depression. So I'm not able to tease apart the genetics from the shared. Okay.
Dr. Clapp?
Yeah. Yeah, Michael.
Sorry, Nerd.
No worries.
Are things like diet and exercise or just individuals' like personal life also taken into account?
Yeah. And see, and this is the thing, if we're doing just a broad family study, I'm probably not looking at levels of diet, levels of exercise, and things like that. And those are things that can 100% start to impact in more complex ways genes that may be involved in certain types of behaviors. So you're absolutely right, Michael. Hold on to that, because that's going to start to get into important when we start talking about some epigenetic stuff. Okay. So for the family study, can start to give us a sense whether or not some trait runs in families, but we can't really tease apart what's genetics and what's just the shared environment that we all experience as my family. Okay. So what we can do is we can start to go into get a little bit more complex, and we can start to look into twin studies, okay? And what we do with twin studies, right? Let's say we're interested in depression, right? And so what I would do is I would get a group of monozygotic twins, okay? What do we call monozygotic twins? Someone help me out. Identical twins. Perfect, Michael. Do we have any any twins in the audience here?
I am too.
Okay, so we got a couple of folks who are twins. Identical or fraternal twins?
Fraternal.
Fraternal. What's that, Kayla?
Identical.
Identical. Okay, cool. So we got Matilda. You're a fraternal twin. Is your twin brother or sister? Brother. Okay. And Kayla, you have an identical twin, right? Okay. So what we would have is we've got two individuals who happen to be a set of twins. Monozygotic twins, identical twins. Kayla, your twin sister is basically the genetic sort of copy of you for all intents and purposes. What we have is a split of the same egg, and so you and your sister identical. And so this is a natural experiment where we have two people who are essentially, for our purposes here, it gets sort of more complicated if you get into the weeds, but are identical or sort of replicants of one another, right? Versus Matilda, your connection with your twin brother, you have the same connection as sort of any other brother and sister, right? You just happen to be born at the same time, right? And so what we've got with our twin studies, what we do is we look at the concordance. And this is what we call concordance. If one twin has it, the other twin has it. What we do is we start to look at concordance across our monozygotic twins and our dizygotic twins, or our identical twins and our fraternal twins. And if we see that some trait of interest has higher levels of concordance, that means the same matching with our identical twins as opposed to our fraternal twins, what do we conclude? Is that stronger evidence for a genetic impact? Yeah. Because if I've got two individuals who are basically clones of one another, and I'm seeing that our clones have a higher likelihood of having this trait in common than people who are 50% genetically similar, as we see sort of brothers and sisters, what we would say is that's a strong evidence of a strong genetic component, right? Because we're seeing it higher in sort of our sort of genetic clones than our folks who are about 50% similar, okay? And what we're assuming with the twin study is this environmental factor, this shared factor, we're saying that that's the same. Like, we're saying that if we're seeing higher concordance in our identical twins than our fraternal twins, it can't be shared environment because you all have the same shared environment. We can't say, oh, it's differences in this and that. Shared environment is the same. We've crossed this out. This is no longer an issue in the twin study. And so if we see higher concordance, let's say we're looking at, and this is an example, just because it's a highly schizophrenia or bipolar, huge genetic component to these conditions, right? And we see much higher concordance in identical twins than we do in fraternal twins. What we do is we assume that this is strong evidence for a genetic component because this shared environment factor, you're both raised in the same house, you both at the same time, both have probably similar experiences, right? And so what we do is we get rid of this, so we cancel or control for the shared environment, and we're going to say that it's sort of the increased concordance is due to genetics. Okay. People see kind of how sort of our twin study is working. What's the one thing that we're not accounting for with our twin study, though? The unique environment. What about this, right? What about all the stuff that makes us us? All the stuff that is unique. So even if I'm a twin, right? Kayla, you have an identical twin. Genetically, you're sort of exactly the same as your sister. But I would imagine that you two aren't exactly the same in all facets and things, right? There are things that make you and your sister. What's your sister's name?
Her name is
Kinley, right? That make Kayla and Kinley different people, right? And this is your unique environment. This is your stuff that your interests and her interests, they keep you sort of, even though you're very similar, maybe in some ways, your own people, right? And this is what we need to account for. And we can't do that in a twin study. So what we have is we have our adoption studies. Okay, adoption studies start to go through and start to be able to tease apart the difference between what's genetic and what's maybe unique environment. And so what we do with our adoption studies, okay, twin stuff, erase twin stuff. We're no longer talking about twins, okay? So Matilda, Kayla, both very important people, but right now it's not about you. We sort of set you aside. You're twin study, folks. We're going to adoption study, folks, okay? And what we're doing here with adoption study is what we're looking, the question here is what's the influence of different environmental factors on genetically similar people, right? So what we would do is we would look at the concordance of a trait across biological and adoptive parents and siblings. So what we would do, let's say we've got a group of individuals who we know to be sort of adopted sort of very early, sort of maybe say right at birth, okay? And let's say if we're interested in the genetic influence on intelligence, okay? And what we would do is we would take these individuals and we would sort of give them, sort of the adopted individuals, maybe give them an IQ test. And then what we would do is we would give IQ tests to their adoptive parents, and then we would give IQ tests to their biological parents. And if we have strong evidence of genetic of heritability in intelligence, what would we expect to find? Who would we expect our adopted kids to be more similar to, the biological parents or the adoptive parents? The biological parents, right? If we have a strong genetic component, we would see that probably sort of my intellectual ability is more similar to my biological relatives than my adoptive parents. Michael, what if intelligence is largely driven by unique environment? It's an environmental factor. It's who I'm, sort of the schools that I go to, sort of the early developmental experiences I have. Who would we see? Would we see more similar to the adoptive parents or the biological parents? Adoptive, right? And so what's really, really interesting with our adoption studies is we can start to tease apart. So for whatever it is that I'm looking at, do people tend to be more similar or look more similar to biological family, sort of biologically related individuals, or the people who they've grown up with, the people that they've been around? Do we see sort of a stronger sort of influence there? And this can be a nice way to start to look at those unique environmental factors and start to tease that apart. Okay. So again, we've got our family study. Question here is a trait more common with in families of individuals who possess that trait? Our twin study, looking at it, is a trait more common among identical twins than among fraternal twins? Our adoption study, what's the influence of environmental factors on genetically similar individuals? So each one of these starts to get at different aspects and teasing apart genetics, shared environment versus unique environment. Okay. And if we go through and we take a look at this from a basic genetics, behavioral genetics standpoint, we've started to identify some sort of relative genetic influence or heritability of certain types of traits, right? So personality and temperament, right? Sort of who you are, sort of how you interact, just your general personality types of stuff. 40 to 60% based on genetic influences. Based on twin and adoption studies, we can see sort of your level of extroversion, neuroticism, conscientiousness, openness to experience, these personality types things. About half of it due to sort of genetic sort of influences, so similarities with my family. But your unique environment accounts for most of the rest of it stuff, right? Like, so if you think about how you are and how your personality is relative to your brothers and sisters, some similarities, right? But you're your own person, right? And sort of right now, your unique experiences that you have that are different from your relatives is determining a big chunk, about half of personality, temperament stuff. Right? If we look at intelligence, again, intelligence, about 50% of the variability of the differences we see based on genetic influences, but about a third of the remaining variability that's left over is due to shared environment, right? So this is going to be, where do I grow up? Do I have families that value education? Did I have access to books? Did I get good schools? These things are stuff that starts to influence intelligence. If we start to look at psychopathology, this is sort of stuff in my area, what we see is increased risk for first degree relatives, and I said for schizophrenia, super high, 5 to 10 times more likely in sort of folks who have family members who struggle with this versus who don't, right? And again, twin and adoption studies seeing strong heritability for bipolar, alcohol use dependence, or alcohol dependence, anxiety, severe depression. Pretty big genetic component to sort of some of these conditions or things that people struggle with. Not as high as like bipolar and schizophrenia, but still strong genetic component to this, right? And so, Julia has a question here. Is it possible that depression is in every other generation? This idea, and you hear this, depression skips a generation? I don't know if there's evidence for that. I think probably not. But what we do know is that if my mom or my dad or my brothers or sisters tend to struggle with depression, anxiety, things like that, the likelihood of me having difficulties in those areas or with some mental health stuff, and we'll talk about this when we get into the clinical stuff at the end, my risk starts to go up relative to someone who doesn't have family members who struggle with that. That doesn't say the people who don't, someone who doesn't have family members who struggle without depression, anxiety, things like that can't develop depression, anxiety. They certainly can. And it doesn't mean that if I have family members, siblings who struggle with anxiety, depression, that I'm 100% sure going to struggle with it. I might not. We're just talking about relative increased risk for certain types of things. And when I'm thinking about this, I also do the same thing with diabetes, sort of weight issues, or any sort of other types of things, height, anything like that. Like if my brother, sisters, mom, dad are tall, the likelihood of me being tall is sort of quite high. But it doesn't have to be, right? So wanted to sort of emphasize that this isn't sort of 100% deterministic. We're just talking about relative risk on stuff. Okay. All right. We'll get into more advanced topics when we touch base on Monday. But any questions about any of the stuff that we've covered up to this point?
I got one real quick.
Yeah.
You know that's like documentary about those three.
Yeah.
So would that be considered an adoption study?
Ramon, so the documentary Ramon is talking about is Three Identical Strangers. Has anybody heard or sort of seen that documentary or watched it? Okay, yeah, it's really good, really intense, and I think does a lot of really amazing stuff about sort of debunking some of this idea behind sort of what does it mean to be a twin, and sort of genetic influences and things like that, right? A lot of similarities, but then some of the stuff that sort of comes out is not it's probably more coincidence and sort of seeing what we want to see and ignoring what we don't want to see or expect. Massive ethical issues with that. Huge. Annie, all those slides, you can download all those slides from Wild Courses. So just go down through and pull those slides up. You can have those all there. Cool. But yeah. So Ramon, would that be so basically, so not to ruin it, but you've got triplets who are identical triplets who were separated at birth and sort of moved out across the country. That starts to get at a cross of like an adoption study and a twin study, and so the methodology starts to get sort of more complicated. For our purposes, you don't have to worry about that. Just know sort of family study, what a family study is supposed to do, a twin study, adoption study. Just leave it at that level. But as we start to sort of try and tease things out, sort of if we have twins, identical or fraternal twins that are adopted and sort of raised apart, there's other stuff that we can do. But then that starts to get sort of down a rabbit hole. So don't need to worry about that. But yeah, excellent question. You're exactly right. That's sort of an interesting sort of way that people go through. And sort of the problem is like you can't follow people around without letting them know that sort of they're part of a study. Yeah, there's huge ethical issues with that remain unresolved. That's pretty criminal. But yeah, good question. Other questions that people have on any of this stuff, either about material or about where we're going, what we're doing, and stuff like that.
Dr. Snore, just for curiosity's sake,
Yeah.
A couple modules ago, we were talking about the nature-nurture debate in psychology and how they kind of accept that they play off each other being separate entities.
Yeah.
How does that relate to genetics, a hard science that's trying to like separate those completely?
Look at you guys coming at me like like a hard, like I like you the hard science, right? Like what I'm doing here is not a hard, like all over the place. Yeah.
Like this is hard science, like yeah, but like I feel like psychology
Right. Yeah.
might
Right.
differ a little bit.
Well, and so this is where, and who someone brought up, maybe Michael, someone talked about this idea of when we started getting into epigenetics, right? The problem with, and I guess for preview for next week, is this idea that like I've got sort of this additive function where my behaviors is based on genetics, is based on shared environment and unique environment. Well, what we found is we start to do this type of stuff is it ends up being considerably more complex than that, because what we have is certain environmental factors can start to switch on and off certain genetic code, right? Some genes can become active sort of in certain situations and not, right? And so let's say, for example, I have a high increased risk for developing bipolar because I just have sort of several people in my family have been diagnosed with bipolar, struggle with bipolar symptoms, right? And let's say I'm a twin, right? I'm an identical twin, and my identical twin has schizo or sort of bipolar disorder. If it was completely genetic, I would 100% end up developing bipolar disorder if it's a 100% genetic thing, right? But even though I have an identical twin, and even if we have very, very much the same experiences, certain types of things I may have been exposed to certain type of stressors or sort of experiences that for whatever reason have activated a certain set of genes that then manifest as symptoms of mania and some of this type of stuff, whereas my other twin doesn't, right? And so what we see, and think about this, it's starting to get cold, right? And if we look at sort of rabbits around, sort of you can see rabbits, right? As it starts to get cold, what happens? They sort of go brown, but if I'm a brown rabbit in the middle of a snowstorm, I'm going to get eaten constantly, right? And so we see change in fur color, right? So we've got the same, that they didn't get new genes, right? We just have some environmental things that start to trigger the different expression of a gene. They turn on a gene or turn off a gene. Same type of thing as we start to get into trying to understand the influence, sort of this nature and nurture thing, right? Looking at it as an interaction and not just like, here's my portion of genetics, here's my portion of my environment, and those are additive and separate. They start to interact with one another. And that's where we start to get in some really cool epigenetic stuff that starts to look at mechanisms and why would we see two people who seem very similar, right, start to have very different types of experiences or sort of different types of things come up. So that was kind of a long explanation, but that's really how sort of this genetic, this nature and nurture thing, this old school idea of is it this or is it this, is actually probably not a great way to think about it because the two things interact with one another. Excellent question.
So I had a question.
Yeah.
So, still on the topic of epigenetics. So is it because of epigenetics where we got the new saying or the saying that they go by of like nature via nurture instead of the nature versus nurture debate?
Yeah, exactly, right. And I think nature via nurture, I think that's a good way to hear it. So another thing you'll hear sometimes you say, genetics loads the gun, nature pulls the trigger, right? So I may have sort of in my genetic code vulnerabilities for certain types of things, right? But the extent to which those things become expressed starts to depend on behavior and sort of the things I do. And so, Michael, you had asked about diet and exercise and things along those lines, right? Like I might have a friend who eats trash all the time and doesn't exercise, and they seem to be pretty fine, right? But perhaps for me, I am more vulnerable for certain types of things. And so if I start to let myself go, if I start to drink too much, or if I start to not exercise or engage in sort of healthy living practices, I'm much more likely to spin into a depressive episode than my friend is, just because I'm sort of working with a different set of starting values. Okay. And so what we see, and in sort of think about this in terms of psychopathology, sort of think like, oh, well, I have vulnerability for this, which makes me kind of bummed out because I think forever and for always I'm going to be depressed. Well, that's maybe not necessarily the case. I might have to do some things that I need to be more mindful than other people do. But that doesn't mean that I am destined to struggle with depression or anything else for the rest of my life. I just might have to approach certain things different ways, right? And when we're talking about this clinically, I'll say, some people have a vulnerability, like maybe I've got a vulnerability for a bad back. Like people in my family have bad backs. And so I know that, and I know that I have to do some certain things that I can't do or need to be careful when I'm in certain situations. That doesn't mean that I'm sort of destined to have back pain and be miserable and not be able to do anything forever and always. But what it does mean is I might need to be a little bit more careful in thinking about sort of how I approach certain things and sort of managing that, sort of recognizing stuff, right? So again, I think the danger with thinking about like genetics is absolutely something that has a big impact on sort of who we are, who we develop into, sort of the certain things that we do. But I think the danger is sort of falling into overly simplistic thinking to say that, genetics determines who I am. And that's not the case. All good questions. This is super interesting stuff. Anybody else have questions about sort of stuff we've gone through or sort of where we're going, anything like that?
Yeah, just for study's sake.
Yeah.
Where are we headed after this? So we got Module 6 starting.
Yeah. So you see what I've done is I've condensed this down. I've got sort of prenatal development is read the chapter on that, but it's basically a couple slides in the lecture. So we'll finish up with genetic stuff next week and then get into sort of developmental stuff. Probably it won't take us all the way through Monday's lecture. We'll jump into the next slide. So just have both of those ready if you're following along. Cool. Anything else, folks? Awesome. Okay. Well, if anything comes up, go ahead, shoot me an email. Again, get in touch if you want to go through and take a look at your quizzes. Again, happy to walk through those with you. Get in touch with me. Get in touch with Natalie too. Natalie will be available if my office hours don't fit. You might be able to set up with something with Natalie. Natalie's fantastic. She'll help you out, get you on track with stuff. Reach out to Samantha. Samantha's been through this. She knows how to sort of go through and be able to give you tips and things like that. Otherwise, if you're good, we'll see you all on Monday. Enjoy your weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll catch you at lecture. Cool. All right, folks. We'll see you. Yep. Thanks.